stroke. So first of all, what is stroke? So another name of the stroke is cerebrovascular accident. So what is the definition of the stroke? So stroke or cerebrovascular accident is defined as abrupt onset of neurologic deficit that is attributable to a focal vascular cause. So this is the definition of the stroke. So stroke is defined as a sudden onset of focal neurological deficit which is attributable to a focal vascular cause. So there are two or three important things in the definition. First, there should be a abrupt onset. Abrupt onset means sudden onset. Second, the neurologic deficit, and third is the vascular cause. So these three elements are required to fulfill the criteria of a stroke. So it should be a sudden onset, it should be a appreciable neurological deficit, and the etiology is due to a vascular cause. So this is the definition of the stroke. So the definition of the stroke is clinical. So by the clinical examination we can judge the patient whether he or she is suffering from the stroke or not. But after the clinical examination we have to label it as a stroke. So for that we require the laboratory studies including the brain imaging to support the diagnosis. So this is the definition of the stroke, and to label the patient as a stroke we require the imaging, brain imaging. So first, stroke can be of two types. It can be a hemorrhagic stroke or it can be a non-hemorrhagic stroke. So hemorrhagic stroke accounts for 15% of all these strokes, and non-hemorrhagic stroke, which is also known as a ischemic stroke, so it accounts for 85% of all these strokes. So in today's class we will discuss regarding the management of the hemorrhagic stroke. So hemorrhagic stroke occurs when a blood vessel in the brain ruptures and bleeds. So in ischemic stroke or the non-hemorrhagic stroke, it is the occlusion of the blood vessel which is leading to the stroke. But in a hemorrhagic stroke, it is the rupture of the blood vessel which is leading to the stroke. So in hemorrhagic stroke, it accounts for 15% of all these strokes, and blood vessel ruptures in a hemorrhagic stroke, whereas it is blocked in the ischemic stroke. So this is the main difference between the ischemic stroke and the hemorrhagic stroke. Either the blood vessel is having occlusion or the blood vessel is having the rupture. So hemorrhagic stroke. So there are different types of hemorrhagic stroke, or the hemorrhagic stroke can occur due to different types. So first, it can be the intracerebral hemorrhage and arteriovenous malformation. Second is the subarachnoid hemorrhage, and third is the different other causes. So we will group all the causes of the hemorrhagic stroke in these three broad subcategories. First is the intracerebral hemorrhage and the AV malformation. Second is the subarachnoid hemorrhage, and third is the others. So in the ICH and AVM there is a rupture of abnormal artery or macroaneurysm which is bleeding into the substance of brain and formation of the hematoma. So in case of intracerebral hemorrhage there is a rupture of the blood vessel in the brain parenchyma, while in the AVM there is a rupture of either the abnormal artery or the aneurysm which is leading to the hemorrhagic stroke. In subarachnoid hemorrhage there is a rupture of the blood vessel and leading to the blood accumulation in the subarachnoid space. Another cause is there is bleeding into the subdural space and the epidural space. So these are the different types of hemorrhagic stroke. So we will learn or discuss one by one. So first is the intracerebral hemorrhage. So ICH, intracerebral hemorrhage is also known as the ICH. Excuse me. So ICH is the second most common cause, accounting for 10% of all these strokes, and 35 to 45% of the patients die within the first month, a rate which is approximately 5 times greater than the ischemic stroke. So by this figure you can judge then the ICH or the intracerebral hemorrhage is having a high mortality rate, that is 35 to 45%. And this ICH or the intracerebral hemorrhage can be due to hypertension, coagulopathy, sympathomimetic drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine, and cerebral amyloid angiopathy. So these are the different causes of intracerebral hemorrhage. Advanced age, heavy alcohol and low dose aspirin use in those without symptomatic cardiovascular disease increases the risk of ICH. and cocaine or methamphetamine use is one of the most important causes in the young. So ICH can be due to different causes. So how will you diagnose the ICH? So ICH is diagnosed through the non-contrast CT stain of the brain. So intracranial hemorrhage is often identified on the non-contrast CT imaging of the brain during the acute evaluation of the stroke. Suppose a patient comes to you with the stroke, and after the clinical examination you can judge whether the patient is suffering from the stroke or not. But only the clinical examination will not make a diagnosis whether the patient is suffering from hemorrhagic stroke or the non-hemorrhagic stroke. So to differentiate the hemorrhagic stroke from the non-hemorrhagic stroke, we require a non-contrast CT stain of the brain. Suppose this is the patient and we have done a non-contrast CT stain of the brain, and this white part is showing the hemorrhagic stroke. So this patient is suffering from the hemorrhagic stroke. Suppose the patient non-contrast CT stain of the brain will be normal. If the normal, then might be the patient is suffering from the non-hemorrhagic stroke. Because CT is more widely available and may be easier to perform than MRI, CT staining is generally the preferred method for the acute stroke evaluation. So CT stain usually preferred over the MRI for the stroke evaluation. So there can be the two common causes by which the CT is preferred over the MRI. First, the CT stain is less expensive than the MRI. Usually CT stain cost is around 1500 to 2000 and MRI cost is around 4000 to 5000. So CT is less expensive than MRI, and second, the CT stain is more widely available than the MRI. So in most of the setups you can find that CT stain is available but the MRI is not available. So that's why we prefer CT stain over the MRI for the stroke evaluation, and this CT stain can differentiate the ischemic stroke versus the hemorrhagic stroke. So how will you do a emergency management of the patient who is suffering from intracerebral hemorrhage? So close attention should be paid to the airway management, because a reduction in the level of consciousness is common and often progressive, and recent clinical trials have shown that systolic blood pressure can be safely lowered acutely and rapidly to less than 140 mm mercury in patients with spontaneous ICH whose initial systolic blood pressure was 150 to 220 mm mercury. So the blood pressure management, and blood pressure should be lowered with non-vasodilating IV drugs such as nicardipine, labetalol or esmolol, and patients with cerebellar hemorrhages with depressed mental status or radiographic evidence of hydrocephalus should undergo urgent neurosurgical evaluation, and these patients require close monitoring because they can deteriorate rapidly. So there are 2 or 3 important things, that is the management of ABC, that is airway, breathing and circulation, then the blood pressure management with the use of non-vasodilating IV drugs, and the stupras or comatose patients with clinical and imaging signs of herniation are generally treated presumptively for elevated ICP, including tracheal intubation and sedation, administration of osmotic diuretics such as mannitol or hypertonic saline, and elevation of the head of the bed while surgical consultation is obtained. And then after doing the management, we go for laboratory and imaging evaluation. Apart from the routine blood chemistries and hematologic studies, specific attention to platelet count, prothrombin time, partial thromboplastin time, and international normalized ratio is important to identify the coagulopathy. And CT stain reliably detects acute focal hemorrhages in the supratentorial space, and pontine or medullary hemorrhages may not be well delineated. An MRI is more sensitive for delineating posterior fossa lesions but not necessary for primary diagnosis. And MRI or CT angiography are used when the cause of intracranial hemorrhage is uncertain, particularly the patient is young or not hypertensive, and the hematoma is not in one of the usual sites of hypertensive hemorrhage. And how will you treat? After immediate attention to the blood pressure and airway protection, focus can switch to the medical and surgical management. And in medical management, for those patients who are taking vitamin K antagonist, rapid correction of the coagulopathy can be achieved by infusing prothrombin complex concentrates, which can be administered quickly, with vitamin K administered concurrently. And the FFP requires larger fluid volumes and longer time to achieve the adequate reversal than PCC, hence not recommended. So is PCC, that is prothrombin complex concentrate, is preferred over the FFP for the medical management. In surgical management, the existing data do not support routine surgical evacuation of the supratentorial hemorrhages in the stable patients. So if the patient is stable, surgery is not routinely required, but only required when the patient is deteriorating. And special consideration should be given when the hemorrhage is in the cerebellum, that is cerebellar hemorrhage. And most of the cerebellar hematomas more than 3 cm in diameter will require the surgical evacuation. And if the patient is alert without focal brainstem signs, and if the hematoma is less than 1 cm in diameter, surgical removal is usually unnecessary. So in more than 3 cm diameter, the surgery is necessary, but if the hematoma is less than 1 cm in diameter, then the surgery is usually not necessary. And patients with hematomas between 1 and 3 cm require careful observation for the signs of impaired consciousness, progressive hydrocephalus, and precipitous respiratory failure. And hydrocephalus due to cerebellar hematoma requires the surgical evacuation and should not be treated solely with ventricular drainage. And prevention, for the prevention we have to prevent the hypertension, because hypertension is the leading cause of primary ICH, and the prevention is aimed at reducing the chronic hypertension, eliminating excessive alcohol use, and discontinuing the use of illicit drugs such as cocaine and amphetamine. So this part is about the intracerebral hemorrhage. Now we will discuss about the vascular anomalies, that is arteriovenous malformations. So vascular anomalies, they can be divided into two parts. So they can be congenital vascular malformation or they can be acquired vascular malformations. So the true AVMs, venous anomalies and capillary telangiectasias are the lesions which remain clinically silent throughout the life. And the largest AVM are usually located in the posterior part of the hemisphere, commonly forming a wedge-shaped lesion extending from the cortex to the ventricle. So these are the congenital vascular malformations. There can be familial AVM can be there. The familial AVM may be a part of autosomal dominant syndrome of hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia, which is known as Osler-Render-Van Du syndrome, due to mutations in either the endoglin or activin receptor like kinase 1, both involved in transforming growth factor signaling and angiogenesis. So apart from the congenital AVM, there can be familial AVM may be found in the patient. And what should be the signs and symptoms in the patient who are suffering from an AVM? That is headache, which may be hemicranial, and throbbing like migraine, or it can be a diffuse headache. Focal seizures with or without generalization occur in 30% cases, and 1/2 of the AVMs become evident as the ICH. And large AVM of the anterior circulation may be associated with systolic and diastolic bruit over the eye, forehead or the neck, and bounding carotid pulse. So these are the different signs and symptoms which can be found in the patients of venous anomalies. So these are the pictures of CT and MR which are showing the AV malformation. So these are the AV malformations through the MRI or the CT scan. And how will you manage the venous anomalies? The MRI is usually better than CT for the diagnosis, although non-contrast CT staining sometimes detects calcification of the AVM, and contrast may demonstrate the abnormal blood vessels. But usually for the venous anomalies, the MRI is preferred over the CT. And once identified, the conventional X-ray angiography is the gold standard for evaluating the precise anatomy of the AVM. So first you go for MRI brain. After MRI brain, then you go for MR angiography, because MR angiography give you regarding the anatomy of the AVM. And the surgical treatment of AVM presented with the hemorrhage often done in conjunction with the pre-operative embolization to reduce the operative bleeding, and it is usually indicated for the accessible lesions. And stereotactic radiosurgery It is an alternative to the conventional surgery, and it can produce a slow sclerosis of the AVM over 2 to 3 years. And because of the relatively low annual rate of hemorrhage and the risk of complications due to surgical or endovascular treatment, the indications for surgery in asymptomatic AVMs are uncertain. So, first of all, you diagnose the venous anomalies through the MRI or MR angiography, then you can do a surgery. The surgery can be the conventional surgery or it can be the stereotactic radio surgery. Now the third part, that is the subarachnoid hemorrhage. So the name itself suggests that the hemorrhage is lying in the subarachnoid space. So what is the etiology of the subarachnoid hemorrhage? So the most common cause is the head trauma, but if you exclude the head trauma, the most common cause of subarachnoid hemorrhage is the rupture of a saccular aneurysm. So aneurysm which is rupturing leading to the subarachnoid hemorrhage. And other causes include bleeding from a vascular malformation and extension into the subarachnoid space from a primary intracerebral hemorrhage. So, but after the head trauma, the most common cause is the rupture of the saccular aneurysm. And what are the saccular aneurysms? The saccular aneurysms are the abnormal focal dilatations of the cerebral arteries with thinning and weakening of the vessel wall. An autopsy and angiography studies found that 2% of the adults harbor intracranial aneurysms, and the overall mortality rate for aneurysmal SAH is 35%, with around one-third of these patients dying immediately and prior to the hospital admission. So this is a high rate of mortality from the aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage, and of those who survive, more than half are left with clinically significant neurologic deficit. So these figures can show that how the serious is the subarachnoid hemorrhage. And if the patient survives but the aneurysm is not obliterated, the rate of rebleeding is for 20% in the first 2 weeks, 30% in the first month, and 3% per year afterward. So what are the risks of the saccular aneurysm? That is the risk of rupture. The annual risk of rupture for the aneurysm less than 10 mm in size is 0.1%, and for the aneurysm more than 10 mm in size, the risk is 0.5 to 1%. So as the size of the aneurysm is increasing, the annual risk of rupture for the aneurysm is increasing. And aneurysm location may also factor into risk, with basilar bifurcation aneurysm appearing to have a somewhat higher rupture risk. So rupture risk is related to the size of the aneurysm and related to the location of the aneurysm. And the three most common locations are the terminal internal carotid artery, middle cerebral artery bifurcation, and the top of the basilar artery. So these are the three most common locations of subsaccular aneurysm. And because of the longer length of exposure to the risk of rupture, younger patients with aneurysm size more than 10 mm may benefit from prophylactic treatment. And this is the grading of the initial clinical manifestation of subarachnoid hemorrhage. So there are two scales, that is, first is the Hunt-Hess scale and second is the World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies scale. Through these scales, the patient of subarachnoid hemorrhage has been divided into grade 5 from grade 1 to grade 5. So whenever a patient presents to you with the subarachnoid hemorrhage, any grading can be used to classify the patient in which grade it is lying. So what is the importance of the grading? So by the time passing, we can judge whether the patient is deteriorating, whether the patient is stable, or whether the patient is improving. So grading is must in any patient of SAH. And imaging is done through the CT stain, and more than 95% of the cases can be visualized on a high quality non-contrast CT stain obtained within 72 hours. If the scan fails to establish the diagnosis of subarachnoid hemorrhage and no mass lesion or obstructive hydrocephalus is found, a lumbar puncture should be performed. So if the diagnosis of SAH is made through the CT stain, the lumbar puncture is not required. But if the diagnosis is not certain, then the lumbar puncture is required. An angiography, that is the 4-vessel conventional X-ray angiography, is generally performed to localize and define the anatomic details of the aneurysm and to determine if other unruptured aneurysm exists. And CT angiography, it is an alternative method for locating the aneurysm and may be sufficient to plan the definitive therapy. And in laboratory evaluation, we first the lumbar puncture. See, lumbar puncture should be done only after the CT stain, but the lumbar puncture prior to an imaging procedure is indicated only if a CT stain is not available at the time of suspected SAH. If the stain fails to establish the subarachnoid hemorrhage, the lumbar puncture should be performed. And the conversion of hemoglobin to the bilirubin stains the spinal fluid yellow within 6 to 12 hours. This xanthochronic spinal fluid peaks in intensity at 48 hours and lasts for 1 to 4 weeks depending upon the amount of subarachnoid blood. So what will you found in the lumbar puncture? So in the lumbar puncture you will found the xanthochronic fluid, that is yellowishness to the spinal fluid due to conversion of hemoglobin to the bilirubin. In electrolytes, you should do a close monitoring either once a daily or twice a daily, because hyponatremia can occur during the first 2 weeks following subarachnoid hemorrhage. And ECG shows different ST and T wave changes which are similar to those associated with cardiac ischemia. So what can be found in ECG? That is prolonged QRS complex, prolonged QT interval, and prominent PED or deeply inverted symmetric T waves, which are usually secondary to the intracranial hemorrhage. And the treatment involves the early aneurysm repair to prevent the re-rupture, prevention of protection of airway, managing the blood pressure before and after the aneurysm treatment, managing the intracranial hypertension, delayed cerebral ischemia and hyponatremia, and to prevent the pulmonary embolism. And how the aneurysm is repaired? Aneurysm is repaired through the clip-in, coil-in, and through the newer techniques. So the clip-in, we put a clip on the aneurysm, which is performed through a neurosurgeon, which wear a metal clip across the aneurysm neck, thereby immediately eliminating the risk of re-bleeding. In coil-in, we put a coil in the aneurysm, which is performed through an endovascular surgeon, where platinum coils or other embolic material are placed within the aneurysm via a catheter which is passed from the femoral artery. And newer techniques, where the newer endovascular techniques which use balloon assisted coiling or placement of flow diverting stent, which are increasing the type of aneurysm amenable to endovascular intervention. So the aneurysm repair can be done through the different types. Then the management of intracranial hypertension. The intracranial hypertension following the aneurysmal rupture occurs secondary to subarachnoid blood, parenchymal hematoma, acute hydrocephalus, or loss of vascular autoregulation. And the patients who are stuporous should undergo emergent ventriculostomy to measure the ICP and to treat the high ICP in order to prevent the cerebral ischemia. And medical therapies which are designed to combat the raised ICP can also be used as needed. And the diffuse cerebral ischemia is the leading cause of mortality and morbidity following the aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage. And treatment is done through the calcium channel antagonist, that is nimodipine, which is given in a dose of 60 mg every 4 hours, which improves the outcome perhaps by preventing ischemic injury rather than reducing the risk of vasospasm. If diffuse cerebral ischemia occurs due to vasospasm which persists despite the optimal therapy, we can go for intra-arterial vasodilators and percutaneous transluminal angioplasty. So if the patient is having persistent DCI, even after medical therapy, we then go for intra-arterial vasodilator and percutaneous transluminal angioplasty. And the many patients, they continue to experience a decline in serum sodium despite receiving the parenteral fluids containing normal saline. So hyponatremia is very common during the treatment of the subarachnoid hemorrhage or following the treatment of the subarachnoid hemorrhage. So hyponatremia should be carefully watched out and should be carefully treated. Frequently, supplemental oral salt coupled with the normal saline will mitigate hyponatremia, but often the patients also require intravenous hypertonic saline. So if the patient is suffering from hyponatremia, you can give oral salt and the normal saline, but if the patient is not responding, then you should go for hypertonic saline. Hypertonic saline is 3% NS. And usually in the normal fluids, either it is a N by 2, that is 0.45%, and in the NS it is 0.9%. But if the patient is not responding, we can go for hypertonic saline, that is 3%. But care must be taken not to correct the serum sodium too quickly in patients with marked hyponatremia of several days duration, as osmotic demyelination syndrome may occur. Suppose the patient is having hyponatremia and you have rapidly corrected the hyponatremia. In that situation, the patient may develop osmotic demyelination syndrome, and this osmotic demyelination syndrome is very dangerous because it is irreversible. And if the suppose the one patient develop the osmotic demyelination syndrome, nothing can be done after that. So always the hyponatremia should be corrected very slowly. And if the patient develops hydrocephalus, and what is hydrocephalus? That is the fluid accumulation within the ventricles, and the management of hydrocephalus depends on whether it is a acute hydrocephalus or it is a chronic hydrocephalus. If the patient is having acute hydrocephalus, the treatment is ventricular drainage, and if the patient is having a chronic hydrocephalus, the treatment is ventricular shunting. So the treatment depends on whether it is acute one or it is a chronic one. And now the last part, that is the DVT treatment and prophylaxis, because these are the patients who are bedridden. So in these patients, the DVT, that is the venous thrombosis, may develop. And what is the dangerous with DVT? Because if the patient develops DVT, the patient is having a higher risk of pulmonary embolism, that is thrombopulmonary embolism. So all these patients should have pneumatic compression stockings which are applied to prevent the pulmonary embolism. And we can, apart from the stockings, we can give unfractionated heparin, which can be initiated within 1 to 2 days following endovascular treatment or craniotomy with surgical clipping, and is a useful adjunct to pneumatic compression stockings. But this unfractionated heparin is contraindicated in patients who are having ruptured and untreated aneurysms, and it is a relative contraindication following craniotomy for several days, and it may delay the thrombosis of a coiled aneurysm. If DVT or PE occurs within the first days following craniotomy, use of an inferior vena cava filter may be considered to prevent additional PEs, whereas systemic anticoagulation with heparin is preferred following the successful endovascular treatment. So DVT treatment and prophylaxis should be kept in mind while dealing a patient of ventricular subarachnoid hemorrhage. All that's in today's class. Thank you.